Welcome to Dig, a history podcast. If you went to high school in the U.S., you probably know about at least one witch hunt of the 1950s, the so-called Red Scare that targeted a nebulous internal enemy, the American communist. The hunt for communists targeted intellectuals at universities and the liberal elements of Hollywood, as well as federal employees. In effect, they targeted those who had the potential to teach a new generation how to think rather than what to think, and those who had a more rapt audience than the federal government has ever had or will ever have. You might have read The Crucible in English class, talked about how it was a thinly veiled allegory for the hunt for communists, and how McCarthyism seized control of daily life and media between 1950 and 1955. What you probably didn't talk much about was the fact that very few communists were actually found in the U.S. government, which is where they were supposed to pose the real threat to American national security. There were thousands of people fired or forced to resign during the period of McCarthy's witch hunts, but very few were confirmed communists. They were instead gay men and women. U.S. senators and newspapers convinced themselves and the public that the double life of the homosexual, who had to keep their true selves secret because of the shame and illegality of their sexual desires, made them susceptible to blackmail and also communist ideology. The lesser-known Lavender Scare resulted in thousands of people being fired or forced from their jobs, dishonorably discharged from the military, and denied positions in the U.S. government because of their sexuality. And those policies were enforced for decades, well after McCarthy faded from the political spotlight, and straight through quote-unquote liberal administrations in 1960, 64, 74, 92, and 1996, and even through the federal decriminalization of same-sex sex in 2003. The Lavender Scare had long-term, life-ruining, and life-ending consequences for thousands of Americans. I'm Avril Earls.
And I am known as Sarah Hanley Cousins.
And we are your historians for this episode of Dig. So in our normal sort of thank you shout out to the historians who inform the work that we do for this episode, this is an episode I've probably actually been writing in the back of my mind for nigh on 15 years. Alan Barrowbay's book Coming Out Under Fire was published in 1990. I was a wee babe at the time and already a standard on LGBT history reading lists before I even got the twinkle of a PhD in my eye. David K. Johnson's book The Lavender Scare was published in 2004, the year I graduated high school, and my MA advisor, Paul DeLon, made sure both were on my comprehensive exams list. The stories of dishonorable discharge from the military and the FBI-supported witch hunt for queer people in the civil service are so ingrained into my brain that they're like memories of something I lived through myself. And in some ways, since I grew up in the era of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, I guess it wasn't ever really that far off. But anyway, this episode is largely drawn from their writings, plus a bunch of historians who've been building on Johnson and Barrowbay's work in the intervening years. As always, I'm grateful to these scholars for their work, for peeling back the curtains on these histories, and especially for the bits that are like roadmaps for how to fight oppression and injustice. We still have so much to learn from history, and hopefully someday we can stop reliving it. In April 1953, President Dwight Eisenhower signed Executive Order 10450. This was the first civil service law that explicitly stated that, quote-unquote, sexual perversion was grounds for not hiring and also for firing federal workers. But the executive order wasn't the catalyst for the Lavender Scare. If anything, it was the policy culmination in what had been a longer-running campaign against so-called, quote, moral weaklings, undesirables, and occasionally, more bluntly, quote-unquote, sexual perverts.
During World War II, the military started trying to screen for genderqueer and potentially, quote-unquote, homosexual individuals. Men had been joining the military and having sex with other men for ever. It doesn't matter what country or time period we're talking about. If someone organized an army, we can pretty much guarantee that there were dudes having sex with one another in that army, right? Historians like George Chauncey, Matt Holbrook, Tom Hulme, James Dayhoff, A.D. Harvey, and many others have chronicled the particularly fruitful explosion of queer sexual opportunity and community during World War I across the United States, Britain, and elsewhere. In the First World War, soldiers dressed in drag to entertain other soldiers, sailors sold sex to other men in every port city they landed, and there were many deeply intimate and sometimes physical relationships between soldiers on the front. Most European and North American militaries had anti-sodomy rules in an effort to try and dissuade the sexual entanglement of soldiers, but to little effect.
If and where women were allowed to participate in the war effort, you'd find lesbians, driving ambulances like May Toopy Lowther, tending to the wounded like Ethel Mary Smythe, or delivering supplies like Gertrude Stein and her partner Alice B. Toklas. You'd also find them among those opposing the war, as members of the Women's Peace Party and other pacifist organizations like Lida Gustava Hyman.
A sort of semi-public queer culture expanded in the 20th century, particularly after World War I, with those friends and lovers collected during the war needing place and space to grow. The post-war period saw a flourishing of gay and lesbian bars in places like New York City, London, Paris, and Berlin, drag balls, a print culture that helped queer people find each other and potential lovers, and greater economic and individual freedom thanks to expanding urbanization and industrialization. There'd been queer cultural and social institutions in earlier centuries. The Molly houses of the 18th and 19th centuries, the theater scene, rent boys in every city selling newspapers and sex, the rumors of sapphism among the bluestockings, a kind of aristocratic homoeroticism embraced by the likes of Oscar Wilde and Walt Whitman. But the 20th century certainly created all kinds of new possibilities, especially for working class young people.
World War II was both a continuation of all this and a backlash. As Alan Barabay has shown, the U.S. military has always been a draw for young queer people. Homosocial bonding in spaces, economic independence from family, and for some, opportunities to travel to places they might see as more open to queer desire. And it's just a side note, this is something they had in common with queer agents of empire, right? Civil servants and the like who'd go to and exploit the sexual economies of colonized peoples. This is really unfortunate. We're not valorizing this in any way, but also really common. So like Roger Casement, Ian Forster, various other people, and if you want recommendations for readings on this, we'll put those in the bibliography.
And listen to the episode on Roger Casement, because we talked about this at some length in talking about his journals, right? The records that he kept of those liaisons, shall we say? Yeah, and also the episode we did on based on Laurie Marhofer's book about Magnus Hirschfeld, who was himself in many ways a sort of imperial exoticist gay man seeking sex in various places. So women like Sergeant Nell Johnny Phelps of the Women's Auxiliary Corps joined up both because they all wanted to serve their country and saw the opportunity to resist gender norms and expectations, and like the men in the military, these women also wanted to seek out other women like them. Notably, after the war, Phelps claimed that she talked Eisenhower out of conducting a witch hunt for lesbians in the WACs by telling him that if he did, her name would be at the top of the list. This story has been repeated in several documentaries, but historians haven't been able to substantiate it and actually have evidence that she wouldn't have been able to sit down in a meeting to have that conversation with Eisenhower based on where he and she were stationed throughout the war. It's become a part of the popular memory of World War II queer history, not least because of what Eisenhower did afterwards with EO 10450 and the reality of lesbians being very much a part of the WAC. A fun little false anecdote in any case.
In Germany, the work of gay rights advocates like Magnus Hirschfeld, which included issuing legal documentation for people to inhabit the gender identity that was right for them, regardless of sex assigned at birth, were undone literally overnight. Sound familiar? The Nazi Party passed expansions on earlier anti-sodomy laws to make arresting queer and trans people easier, throwing them in prison or concentration camps by the thousands.
In the United States, World War II was the first time that the military started screening potential recruits for signs of sexual abnormality, as well as a range of physical and mental disabilities. The military wanted to exclude the disabled, who would later need long-term health care under the purview of the Veterans Administration. Men and women were sorted into various classifications to determine if they were, quote, fit or unfit for military service, in very eugenic terms. Class 4F referred to men who were deemed, quote, unfit for service due to physical, mental, or moral reasons. Medical and military officials believed that they could identify a homosexual based on how he or she walked, talked, and or looked that didn't meet, quote, normal masculine or feminine standards. This rule was applied more frequently to men whose sexual behavior or potential was perceived as a threat to the quote-unquote normal American soldier. The word normal is like really powerful there, right? Like that is a term that has its own social construction, right?
Indeed, and I'm going to talk about it right now. Julian Carter has shown that between 1880 and 1940, cultural discourses of whiteness and heterosexuality fused to form a new concept of the quote-unquote normal American, wrapped up in eugenic thought and white supremacy. Normal was defined in these medical, political, and social discourses as both white and heterosexual. So things like the normal body type, weight, proportions, etc. were based on an average white cis man and white cis woman. And this was done quite literally. Two archetypes of the quote-unquote average American were created for the 1939 New World's Fair, named Norman and Norma. Norman was based on the measurements of several million 20-year-old doughboys or World War I recruits and Ivy League students. Norma was the average of 15,000 American women from across the U.S.
The bodily standards extracted from those averages, from this invented normal phenotype of American men and women, have since been integrated into modern medicine, clothing sizing, and, of course, beauty standards. Think about what color the nude tights actually are, or how people with more melanin struggle to find makeup in their shade carried in drugstores until very recently, or the absurd and racist body mass index. The shape and sizes of quote-unquote standard clothes in department stores. Because of the specifics of where these sample bodies were drawn, military, colleges, etc., the majority of the bodies were white, abled, and cis. Those specifications ensure that what is considered normal in this country is also white, abled, and cis.
And at the same time, reproductive heterosexuality in normal married couples was redefined as central to legitimate membership in the nation, supported by things like tax incentives for married couples with children. Instead of saying what they meant, that one had to be white and heterosexual to fit into American society, as well as, able and cis, progressive era white elites reconceived their racial and sexual ideal as normal, right? This innocuous word that just means average, normal. They made it seem more inclusive, even as they drew boundaries of in-group and out-group more definitively in a post-emancipation country. Those who didn't fit into the racial sexual boundaries of normality then were ineligible for political or social mobility.
Of course, same-sex desiring men and women still both made it into military service because these socially constructed ideas of normality were just that, socially constructed, and not real evidence of who or what a person was or might do. And men continued to perform in drag shows for the troops. They had sex, they fell in love, they fought and died for their country and for each other. Alan Barabay notes that thousands made it through the screening process because of the sheer need during World War II, but that individual anti-gay military leaders would lead purging campaigns due to their own prejudices, or if a same-sex desiring soldier or sailor was later caught having sex with someone of the same sex, they were dishonorably discharged, losing access to any and all benefits associated with veteran status. Between 1947 and 1950, the military purged queer men and women under the auspices of quote-unquote moral depravity, and that crusade was quickly picked up by the federal government as well.
The U.S. saw the growth of queer public life after World War II. Historians Liz Kennedy and Madeline Davis mapped the lesbian bars and house party scenes of Buffalo, New York, which proliferated after World War II. Even in the rural South, both John Howard and E. Patrick Johnson's work demonstrates the pockets and corners where queer people and trans people, white and black, found each other, formed community, and built lives outside the constraints of heteronormative expectations. According to Barabay, with greater visibility came greater backlash from both hateful Christian nationalists and white supremacists invested in holding on to the fabricated standard of normality and citizenship, and from policymakers in the U.S. government. Not all queer Americans participated in that public life openly. Many of the veterans of the war, for example, did their best to conform to what was normal. They used the GI Bill to go to college and buy houses, took office and factory jobs, married someone of the opposite sex, and kept their heads down. But some couldn't fully contain that part of themselves. They might follow their desires into bar bathrooms or hotel rooms, spouse aware or none the wiser, thinking, what's the harm?
Well, the harm was if they got caught, or for those who participated a bit more openly, not entirely, of course, because their families likely didn't know, and that isn't something they disclose to employers or coworkers or maybe even friends, that if they were outed, they could lose their jobs. Some employers might have been reasonable and assumed that how you comported yourself outside the office or the factory was your business, but not the U.S. government. At the same time, the military was finally enforcing its anti-homosexual policies and dishonorably discharging thousands of active service members. A few elected officials took up the crusade as well. Amidst the growing national awareness of queer and trans people, thanks to national media coverage fomenting moral panic about the quote-unquote homosexual menace and its threat to American children, the media, government officials, and church leaders demanded conformity and rejected deviance. As Barabay notes, newspaper and magazine articles, books, and advertisements, early television programming, and films, quote, promoted idealized versions of the nuclear family, heterosexuality, and traditional gender roles for the home and workplace.
According to historian David K. Johnson, by November 1950, nearly 600 gay and lesbian federal civil servants were fired. Scholars of McCarthyism from the 1970s on largely ignored the U.S. government's targeting of homosexuals, either willfully or because they didn't understand the sometimes coded language the newspapers and politicians used to describe their victims. It was true that McCarthy himself was careful to steer clear of the homosexual panic, perhaps because he was a confirmed bachelor and just as susceptible to the rumors of D.C. as all those who were targeted. But his colleagues like Styles Bridges, Clyde Hoey, and Kenneth Wary intentionally targeted gay men and lesbians in their anti-communist moral purge. Their claim over and over was that the homosexual was the most susceptible to being blackmailed by communists, if they weren't already communists themselves, and so they posed a major national security risk. As Senator Wary, Republican from Nebraska, put it, quote, "Can you think of a person who could be more dangerous to the United States of America than a pervert?"
The alleged threat of the homosexual to public morality was a constant theme in American media. When it came to McCarthy's purges, the focus was always on communists and communism. But of the 654 total State Department employees fired between 1946 and 1953, 402 left after they were accused of being homosexual. Focusing the 1950s purges to McCarthy both sidelined the much more damaging, at least in terms of casualties, Lavender Scare, and also absolved the large number of Republicans and other conservatives who participated in the hunt for quote-unquote internal enemies in the early years of the Cold War. He led the charge, but he had plenty of help and support from his colleagues.
Between the 1930s and 60s, law enforcement agencies across the U.S. targeted gay, lesbian, and trans people in increasingly violent and public ways. In the 1940s, news agencies decided that stories of disappeared or raped and murdered children were linked to the new homosexual, described by Alfred Kinsey in his best-selling Sexual Behavior in the Human Male. Cops raided bars catering to explicitly gay, lesbian, and trans clients frequently. As Anna Levosky notes, police were sent into those spaces in plain clothes to catch out and bait queer people. In 1947, the U.S. Park Police in Washington, D.C. began a quote-unquote sex perversion elimination program to arrest and intimidate gay men. Vice officers surveilled public bathrooms through peepholes and two-way mirrors. In the long run, this ramped up policing backfired because vice squads campaigns forced the public to wrestle with the law's treatment of queer people. Their tactics also raised issues around the limits of ethical policing and the authority of quote-unquote experts.
Among those who challenged this increased policing and harassment of queer and trans people were the early homophile organizations like the Mattachine Society and the Daughters of Bilitis. The Mattachine Society was founded in Los Angeles in 1950 by Harry Hay, a communist organizer and gay rights activist, as well as Bob Hall, Chuck Rowland, Dale Jennings, Conrad Stevens, James Gruber, and Rudy Gernreich. Primarily white gay men occupied leadership positions in the organization, though at the time, the leadership was secret for all sorts of obvious reasons that what they were doing and who they were was illegal, and the organizational structure was modeled on communist political organizations. Their goal was to fight for gay men's rights and to raise awareness and educate members on the relationship between social justice and homosexuality. The LA branch of the Mattachine Society was investigated by the FBI between 1953 and 1956 under suspicion of communist activity.
The Daughters of Bilitis formed in 1955 in San Francisco as a lesbian rights organization. They were initially unaware of the LA gay men's movement, but their nationally distributed and radically feminist publication, The Ladder, soon brought the DOB into conversation with the Mattachine Society. The LA Mattachine branch moved to San Francisco in 1955, and then Mattachine chapters opened across the U.S. in New York in 1955, D.C. in 1961, Chicago in 1965, Philadelphia in 1966, which was founded by 4 women, and in Buffalo, New York in 1970, all with a goal of challenging the legalized discrimination and harassment of queer people. Many chapters of the Mattachine Society used protest and picketing to raise awareness of queer struggles. Several enforced strict dress codes for their members on these picket lines. Men were to dress in suits and ties. Women were to wear dresses or skirts, right, to conform to sort of respectable ideas of masculinity and femininity. The idea behind these respectability politics was to demonstrate that queer people were normal, that they only wanted the same basic rights as other normal straight people, the opportunity to form nuclear family units, be productive members of the capitalist society, and fit in.
The Daughters of Bilitis were less interested in conforming to middle-class and white ideas of normalcy. The DOB was founded by Filipina Rose Bamberger with her partner Rosemary Slipen and 3 other couples, Del Martin and Phyllis Lyon, Marcia Foster and her partner June, and Noni Fry and her partner Mary. Initially, they were a social club, trying to carve out space for themselves beyond the frequently raided gay and lesbian bars. They quickly launched a lesbian rights movement out of Rose and Rosemary's apartment and began publishing The Ladder, which started out with quote, 100 complimentary copies of the first issue, printed and mailed to friends, friends of friends, and professional women, lawyers, doctors, business owners listed in the San Francisco phone book, as well as to researchers like the team working with Alfred Kinsey at Indiana University. News of the magazine quickly spread. They were able to sustain publication with $1 subscription fees in the first year and then $2.50 by 1957. It generated donations and spread information about social events and gatherings. By the mid-1960s, it became a leading publication in radical feminist and lesbian activism. As the homophile movement shifted from social and lightly political to full-on activism in the 1960s, established publications like The Ladder were essential to the movement.
As queer and trans people dared to live more openly at mid-century, the anti-homosexual propaganda from the media and government ramped up and fueled hatred, harassment, and violence. In February 1950, Secretary of State Dean Acheson appeared before the House Appropriations Subcommittee. When pressed on the matter of security risks in the State House, he insisted that only one employee had ever been fired for being a potential security risk, which would basically include spies, Nazis, or communists. On the subject of if or how many State Department employees had resigned instead of being fired after being investigated as potential security risks, Deputy Undersecretary John Purifoy revealed that 91 people had resigned. When asked to specify what kind of security risk they posed, Purifoy said that they were people of moral weakness and so forth. When asked to clarify further, he said, "Most of these were homosexuals, Mr. Chairman." In the years that followed, the 91 became the shorthand used in media and congressional discussion to refer to the Lavender Menace that threatened the United States of America.
Just as a bit of context, 91 is quite a lot when you consider that there were just around 1,400 total employees of the executive branch of government in 1950. That's spread across the Department of Defense, the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, and the Departments of Treasury, Interior, and Veterans. So 91 from one department is quite a lot over 3 years.
The State Department was given a sort of carte blanche to intimidate and fire potential security threats shortly after the Iron Curtain fell on Europe. In 1947, the Appropriations Committee added the McCarran Rider to the appropriations bill for the State Department, which permitted the Secretary of State to, quote, dismiss any employee for his absolute discretion as he deemed such action advisable in the interest of national security. The committee followed up yearly to ensure that the rider was being enforced. And, as Purifoy noted in a public hearing in 1950, it certainly was, though almost exclusively enforcing the resignation of quote-unquote sexual perverts.
Starting from the February 1950 revelation that there were a startling number of queer State Department employees who'd been forced to resign, and an unknown number yet to be discovered, the Lavender Scare seized national and congressional attention. Shortly after the Undersecretary of State shared the 91 number, Representative Claire Hoffman, a Republican from Michigan, claimed that his constituents were more concerned about the homosexual than about communism. Quote, they are concerned before they get to the issue of communism or loyalty with this issue of morality and decency. From late March to May of 1950, Senator Kenneth Wary, a Republican, and Senator J. Lister Hill, a Democrat, began an intensive investigation into the homosexual threat to America. The evidence they collected was lost or destroyed. All we have is media coverage of the investigation and 2 published reports, one from each senator.
The head of the D.C. Metropolitan Police Department's Vice Squad claimed that 5,000 homosexuals lived in D.C. and that 3,200 were federal employees. This was an estimate, pure speculation, but seized upon by the press and Wary and Hill. Wary and Hill, like the Appropriations Committee, were insistent that homosexuals in the government opened the government up to infiltration by communists. As Wary put it, quote, "Only the most naive could believe that the communist fifth column in the United States would neglect to propagate and use homosexuals to gain their treacherous ends." Wary and Hill convinced the Senate that they needed to undertake a comprehensive investigation of, quote, "the alleged employment by the department and agencies of the government of homosexuals and other moral perverts."
So in June 1950, Senator Clyde Hoey, chairman of the Committee on Expenditures in the Executive Departments, was joined by Democrats James Eastland, John McClellan, and Herbert O'Connor, and Republicans Carl Munt, Andrew Scheppel, and Margaret Chase Smith. They formed the Hoey Committee, tasked with investigating the sexual lives of government employees. They never heard from any gay or lesbian employees, but instead gathered testimony from federal agencies, law enforcement, judicial authorities, and the medical community to try and understand homosexuality and its potential impact on the federal government. Several committee members considered Margaret Chase Smith's presence an impediment. They wanted to ask more explicit questions about sex and sexual behavior, but couldn't due to a woman's presence. Because, of course, women cannot handle hearing about fellatio and anal sex. We can't. We don't know anything about it.
No, we don't read Hermione fan fiction at all.
We definitely do not do that.
They collected names of suspected homosexuals in federal agencies. They conducted surveys of government agencies to determine their existing policies for homosexual employees, to which most came out against the suitability of queer people for work in their offices. Secretary of Commerce Charles Sawyer declared, quote, "The privilege of working for the United States government should not be extended to persons of dubious moral character, such as homosexuals or sex perverts. The confidence of our citizenry in their government would be severely taxed if we looked with tolerance upon the employment of such persons."
Some department heads were more moderate. Howard Colvin, acting director of the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service, asserted that homosexuals could make good employees. Quote, "Since it is possible, according to our understanding of medical and psychiatric opinion on the subject, for a homosexual to lead a normal, well-adjusted life, we do not consider that such a person necessarily constitutes a bad security risk. We believe that each such case would have to be decided on its own merits."
This investigation went on for months, held conferences with police officials in Baltimore, New York City, and Philadelphia, and called in medical experts to attest to the fitness and illness of homosexuals. Undoubtedly, the response from medical experts were not as simply damning as some of the members of the committee hoped. Most psychiatrists and medical officers hedged. There was no simple test to determine if someone was a homosexual, nor any singular mental state that could be attested to homosexuality. Like any subset of the population, there were homosexuals who were mentally ill, and as one psychiatrist put it, there are plenty more who were, quote-unquote, well-adjusted. Though the DSM would classify homosexuality as a mental illness in 1952, there was really no consensus among medical professionals to support that classification before 1952 or after.
One of the outcomes of the Hoey investigation was that forced resignations could no longer be done quietly. Gay and lesbian federal employees who were caught out after 1950 were more likely to have perversion or homosexuality added to their record, making it near impossible to find suitable work elsewhere. And the opportunity for being caught increased as the homosexual panic increased after 1950. Milton Ladd, assistant to the director of the FBI, happily reported to the Hoey Committee that the FBI had instructed police departments throughout the United States to indicate on any arrest fingerprint cards the federal employment of the individuals arrested. As National Archives writer Judith Atkins puts it, a man could be picked up in California for responding to an undercover vice officer's suggestive remarks and end up losing his government job 2,000 miles away in Washington, D.C.
Following the Hoey Committee investigation, Eisenhower issued Executive Order 10450 in 1953, which facilitated federal discrimination against homosexuals for decades. In the State Department, Peace Corps and Jobs Corps, so sort of liberal programs of the 1960s, still screened for homosexuals as late as the 1970s.
Why these state-led crusades happen matters as much as documented that they did happen or are happening. There were undoubtedly politicians and church leaders who believed that the threat queer people posed to the heterogeneous, white supremacist, Christian national ideal was bad, no doubt. Clearly, there are ignorant, narrow-minded people who truly believe that even now, who fear that if we poke holes in the rigid box of what is quote-unquote normal, then the whole thing will collapse, who think that human and civil rights are a pie that is divided, and if we give rights to non-white, non-hetero, non-cisgender people, that the white hetero-cis people will get fewer rights. But that, of course, is not how rights work.
That is kind of how power and wealth works. And the people with power and wealth have convinced the people without that the fight is over rights, to distract from their power grabbing and wealth hoarding. So certainly for some of these crusaders, targeting gay men and women was a distraction. Inventing an internal enemy, whether it be communists or homosexuals or Jews or trans people or immigrants, and the way that they will quote-unquote harm the quote-unquote good citizen, is a tale as old as time. It's a particularly popular tactic among fascist regimes and dictators. If the masses are occupied with an imaginary battle against moral enemies, they won't pay attention to the real arbiters of suffering.
So this is a pretty shitty situation for queer people at mid-century, especially if they had aspirations to work in the civil service, to serve in the Peace Corps or the Job Corps, or serve their country. They either had to resign themselves to an unhappy life pretending to conform to the newly enshrined social and sexual standards, or face blackballing or dishonorable discharge, ruining their futures and limiting their employment options indefinitely.
This was the case for Frank Kameny, an astronomer for the Army Map Service. Kameny was a Spitfire. He was born in 1925 to Jewish parents in New York City. His dad was an electrical engineer and his mom was a secretary. He was accepted to college at the age of 16 at CUNY for physics. At 17, he told his parents he was an atheist, and in his early 20s, he told them he was gay. He recalled as a 20-something calling up his mother at one point and telling her that he was who he was, that the world was wrong about what that meant, not him, and that he would prove it eventually. During World War II, he enlisted under the Army Specialized Training Program and was sent to University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana to learn electrical engineering. After the war, he earned his PhD from Harvard, finishing in 1956. That same year, he was arrested in San Francisco after he was seen by a peeping cop having sex with another adult man. Kameny was detained, and the San Francisco Municipal Court offered him the option to plead guilty and accept a $55 fine and a 6 months probation. He accepted, a mistake that he would never make again, admitting. And the next year, he got a job with the Army Map Service. When his employer learned that he'd been arrested for consensual sexual contact with another man, he was fired and then barred from future employment by the federal government under the terms of Executive Order 10450.
Most of the men and women who'd resigned or been fired between 1947 and 1957 did not fight back. Their family situations or other personal circumstances likely meant that being outed publicly in the process of appealing their dismissal was just too dangerous or too potentially damaging. But as David Johnson discovered when he talked to Frank Kameny, the tenacious young man was unwilling to sit back and let his life be ruled by bigotry. For months after his termination, he wrote letters to try and change his circumstances. Here's one. Quote, "Dear Mr. Secretary, I continue to apply for jobs in your department, only to be told that I'm well qualified, but that government policy will not allow my employment. All I ask is for you to consider me as an individual. I am ready, willing, and able to be of service to our country, and I appeal to you to give me the chance to do so. Most sincerely yours, Dr. Franklin E. Kameny." Oh, adorable. In 1961, after his appeal failed, he founded a Washington, D.C. chapter of the Mattachine Society with Jack Nichols. Though he wasn't a lawyer, he consumed legal briefs and case law so that he could represent himself and any other queer federal employee who was dismissed because of their sexuality. He led a charge to fight back against the discrimination that he and thousands of others had suffered.
Kameny was the first that we know of who fought back. One reason he was able to was because he was fired. He didn't resign under the pressure of investigation like so many before him. And in trying to appeal for public support, he framed the issue as an infringement on civil rights, right? Wrongful termination of contract. Morality, which is a subjective framework, was irrelevant. He shot down claims that homosexuals were susceptible to blackmail or that they were communists. If he was an out gay man, how would he be susceptible to blackmailing, right? He wouldn't be. In 1960s Washington, D.C., civil rights was the language of resistance. He filed the first gay rights appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. And then every 4th of July from 1965 to 1969, he and Craig Rodwell led the annual Reminders, a public demonstration for gay equality, marching outside of Independence Hall. He and gay rights activist Barbara Giddings convinced activists from New York City, D.C., and Philadelphia to join the demonstrations, carrying signs demanding equality. They suspended their D.C. march to instead join the Christopher Street March commemorating the 1969 Stonewall riots.
With Barbara Giddings, Kameny waged a multi-year campaign against the American Psychiatric Association, or the APA, for its classification of homosexuality as a mental illness. They disrupted annual meetings, organized panels for the APA annual meeting, until the APA finally removed homosexuality as a mental illness category from the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, in 1973. Common treatment for homosexuality from the 1950s through to the 1970s included electroshock therapy, long-term institutionalization, and even lobotomy. So for many, it was too late. But for those who came after, there was hope.
Jamie Schumacher grew up in Kentucky and graduated from the University of Louisville, where he studied a variety of languages, including French, German, Spanish, and Russian. He wanted to pursue a career in language and linguistics, so his brother suggested that he look into the National Security Agency. In 1974, he was hired as a language analyst working on high-priority missions. While studying at the NSA's Foreign Language Institute, the students were encouraged to speak about their lives in the target language for practice. And during these conversations, Schumacher was open with his classmates about being gay. Though we don't know for sure if one of his classmates or someone else listening keyed in on this, the results were the same. He'd come out as gay in his workplace, and he was in a high security clearance position, and per federal policy, that wasn't allowed. The fallout didn't take long. Schumacher remembered it this way, quote, "I was sitting at my desk at NSA. My supervisor came around, tapped me on the shoulder and said, 'You're wanted in security.' And sitting there are several officials. 'We understand you're leading a gay lifestyle.' And they took my badge, and they told me that I can't be gay and work there at the same time. So immediately, when I got home that night, I called up Dr. Franklin Kameny. I'd read about him, and I knew that he took on cases like this. So I identified myself on the phone. I told him what had happened, and there was a silence there. And then, all of a sudden, boom, he said, 'How could you possibly have said anything to them about anything? You should not have let them take your badge. Why didn't you hold on to it? Why didn't you keep your mouth shut? Never, never say anything.' And oh my gosh, I was just like rattling on the phone, listening to this. But after he calmed down, then he said, 'You're not going to say another thing to the agency. I'm now your effective counselor. It's in my hands. Don't worry.' And immediately, he's firing off letters to the agency."
Kameny was an astronomer and a physicist, not a lawyer. But in the 2 decades since he'd lost his own job, he'd become a dab hand at challenging the federal government and other professional agencies over discrimination. Kameny got himself and Shoemaker a meeting with the NSA leadership. They met with Admiral Inman, who said Shoemaker could keep his job if he agreed to abide by certain conditions, including telling his family, abiding by the laws of the jurisdiction where he lived concerning public conduct, which is code, right? And not getting involved in public activities which may compromise NSA's anonymity policy. Shoemaker agreed and became the first NSA employee to successfully challenge and circumvent anti-homosexual policies of the federal government.
Despite the small victories won by Kameny and his comrades in the larger queer and trans rights movement across the country in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, change ground out very slowly. Suspected or openly queer people continued to be denied security clearances and promotions and jobs into the 1990s. In 1995, Bill Clinton finally issued an executive order that countered 10450, ending the legal discrimination against federal employees on the basis of sexuality, at least in the civil service. But Clinton's official overriding of EO 10450 in 1995 only really smoothed the way for queer people in civil service. Let's not forget that the year before, he reaffirmed these prejudices against queer people in the military with the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, which he signed into law. Don't Ask, Don't Tell prohibited the military administration from asking a soldier about their sexuality, but any who dared to disclose that they were gay, bisexual, or lesbian could be, and usually were, discharged. Each victory was celebrated, but Kameny and the other advocates and activists fighting discrimination could not let up, could not back down or become complacent just because they got one guy his job back or convinced the APA to stop calling same-sex desire a mental illness. It was, and continues to be, unfortunately, an ongoing struggle for civil rights.
President Obama signed legislation allowing gay people to serve openly in the United States military in 2010. For the thousands who were dishonorably discharged during World War II and on because of their sexuality, it was too little, too late, of course. And the thousands since 1995 who were forced by their employer to be closeted. In June 2024, Joe Biden issued a pardon for all the queer members of the military who were dishonorably discharged for violating Article 125 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, which prohibited soldiers from having sex with anyone of the same sex. Really, too little, too late. As of September 2024, only 8 people had applied for that pardon, in part because it only applied to those military court convictions and not the hundreds or thousands who were forced out on a variety of trumped-up charges and threats. That damage was already done. The pardon is just too little, too late. But it is ultimately closer to what we want, acknowledgement of and reparations for harm done, and a way to move forward. The arc of the moral universe only bends towards justice if we, the people, stand up against those injustices.
What I think is important to remember about Executive Order 10450, the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, and all the rest of this story, is that resistance eventually worked. It took decades, and many lives were ruined or harmed. There is no denying that is true. But when enough people stand up against the corrupt, the philandering con artists, they win. We win. So don't let the barrage of shit overwhelm you, because that's what they're counting on. That if they throw enough at us to cause chaos and overwhelm us, then we'll shut down and give up. But we can't. We have to keep writing letters and calling and faxing our representatives. We have to march. We have to canvass for progressive candidates. We have to support each other. We have to celebrate victories when we get them. We have to mourn the losses, and then we have to dust ourselves off and get back to work. In whatever way you can resist, resist. In whatever way you can help, help. Frank Kameny and Johnny Phelps didn't give up, and neither can we. We stand in solidarity with queer and trans people everywhere. This podcast was produced by the historians of DIG, Elizabeth Garner-Mazurek, Sarah Hanley-Cousins, Marissa Rhodes, and me, Avril Earls. Thanks for listening.
People, don't talk to cops. Don't talk to cops. Have you seen that? Have you seen that video of the lawyers?
Shut the fuck up.
Shut the fuck up. That
Cops
is right.
come to your door, shut
People.
the fuck up.
Shut the fuck up.
Driving away from a protest, shut the fuck up. ICE comes to your fucking classroom, shut the fuck up.
Just general shutting the fuck up. Yep, shut the fuck up. Oh.
Biscuits and gravy.
I mean, it just looks, it's like really topping out in that box.
It is?
Yeah. Okay, what if I turn down? Which way is down?
Neither of them. I don't actually know what the buttons on the microphone do.